Hey, everybody, this is Clarissa Ball, producer and moderator of CT's flagship news podcast, The Bulletin, and I am joined with Mike Cosper tonight, our senior commentator at the show. We're so glad to have you joining us. Please go ahead and say hello in the comments. Tell us where you're joining from. We've got a good show for you tonight. So glad that you're with us. Mike, before we hopped on here, you were just about to tell me about seeing Fiddler on the Roof a whole bunch, which happens to be my very favorite musical of all time. So how many times have you seen it recently?
In the past 2 weeks, I've seen it. I guess I've seen it 5 times. I missed one performance. My kids are in it. My
Okay.
kids were in alternate casts, so there were 6 performances over 2 weekends. I saw it 5 out of the 6 times I was there, and it's a phenomenal show. It's a unfortunately a quite relevant show to our cultural, political, geopolitical moment. So
Yeah, it
yeah.
feels very prescient. Okay, if you were to choose a character to be, who would you be in Fiddler on the... I already know my answer, so,
I,
you know.
I mean, I would have to be the papa, right? Like I'm a father. My daughters are coming into age of like they're high up there in their teenage year. Like one of them played Golda, the other one played Hoddle.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I mean, that's the character
No
I
model
most
the
identify
tailor.
with. But no, definitely not. But I don't want a sewing machine. I don't live and dream of a sewing machine. But I'll say this: what I actually would identify with the most is Larry David singing tradition to the Klansmen in
Oh
an episode
my.
of Curb Your Enthusiasm, which is maybe one of the
Wow.
greatest moments in all of television.
Well, it seems appropriate that I would not have seen that. I feel like I'm probably a decade behind in every show that I watch.
It's worth watching. You would appreciate it. Again, unfortunately, quite relevant, but yeah, no,
Yeah,
it's this
yeah.
great. It's this whole thing. He walks out of a coffee shop, and he's got his coffee in his hand, and he bumps into a Klansman on the way to the rally,
Oh my goodness.
and spills his coffee all over the Klansman's robe, which is in his arms, and
Wow.
it starts this whole thing where like Larry promises to get the thing cleaned. He feels terrible. He's trying to make it up to him. And then he starts asking him, why the robe? Why the robe in the hood? And the guy says, tradition. Don't you understand anything about tradition?
Yeah.
And Larry says, tradition? And he goes straight into a sort of monologue performance
Yeah.
of the opening lines of the musical. People
Wow.
are already clicking away. They're bored. They don't
Oh
need me to.
no.
This
Oh
is
no.
not the Larry David
This
recap
is
show.
not the content. Well, I sort of imagine like if there were the many lives of Mike Cosper, I imagine that you began as a sort of Perchik character.
Okay.
The
Okay.
young Russian intellectual character, and that
He's a
maybe...
communist. I kind of hate
Oh,
Perchik for
that's
being a
true.
communist, but
Okay.
it's not me.
I would be Yenta. I would be the Yenta.
You
I
would
mean,
be into. Oh my gosh, someone
I
should put you in the matchmaking business for
well,
sure.
no one has ever asked me to function in that way for them, but
That's
if they
unfortunate.
did, I would be so happy to do that. I mean, I don't know. I look around and I see so many eligible bachelors and ladies, and I think, maybe it's the age I'm at
Just do
that
the math.
as
Just
you
do the
near
math, right?
50, you start to think about not, having babies and getting married, but other people having babies and getting married. So I don't know. Yenta is, and she speaks her mind, and I really
Oh boy,
appreciate
does
that.
she.
Yeah. So, anyways,
In my daughter's cast, the funniest scenes were my daughter as Golda and the
oh, I
character that
bet.
played Yenta. It was like they had the rhythm of the dialogue down. It was really funny. It was great. Okay, enough
So
proud
good.
dad moment.
So good. Anyways, okay. So speaking of shows, you have been, I feel like there is sort of, we're on this rotation of like some weeks I hear from Mike Cosper and some weeks I don't hear from Mike Cosper. And the weeks I don't, I know that you are in a dance with the devil, shall we say, the devil in the deep blue sea. This is an on week. You dropped an episode this week. Is that right?
That's right. We dropped an episode this morning. The Devil in the Deep
Okay.
Blue Sea, episode 4. Um, Remembering What Never Happened is the title of the
Oh,
episode that dropped today.
that sounds, they all sound spooky to me. I mean, I'm wondering as as you've engaged with this content now for a long time. I mean, this has been over a year's worth of research,
For
right?
sure.
Putting into
Yeah.
this show. what has challenged you personally when you've engaged with this content? I mean, last time we talked, I asked, like, how do you sort of detox from it? But I'm wondering, as you've gone through it, is there stuff that has just been very convicting for you personally?
Yeah, I don't think it spoils the episode to say what I'm about to say, because I mean people can just, yeah, it's not. I mean, we kind of preview this on the opening episode, but we talk quite a bit about an incident that took place that's kind of known as the McMartin daycare scandal, the McMartin daycare prosecutions as well. This was like a well-known, well-loved, family-run daycare in Southern California, Manhattan Beach, California, and a woman calls up the cops one day and makes these wild, crazy accusations about satanic ritual abuse and a guy who's like flying around the room on a broom, levitating, like all like the kind of wild stuff that had there not been an atmosphere in which that had been sort of cultivated to expect this sort of thing, most people would have gone, man,
You would have
something's
imagined
really.
Gene Wilder, right?
Yeah, well, you would have
Flying
thought
around.
like something's going on with this woman. Like, what do we
Yeah.
need to do to how do we get this woman some help? But instead, they started this investigation into the daycare. They ended up initially filing charges against 7 of the workers at the daycare, more than 400 charges of abuse and molestation and all the rest. None of which the police actually think ever happened. Well, I should say, not the police. None of which forensic experts and child psychologists and other people who've gone back and looked at it believe anything ever actually necessarily happened. It destroyed these people's lives. It took more than 5 years to prosecute and cost more than $15 million. It's the most expensive, at the time, most expensive lawsuit in history. And it was really, it was really about a woman who was mentally unwell, who had sort of imagined a lot of these things. But once it was seeded, and once the police get involved, it just erupts. And so you were saying, like, what gets to you?
Yeah.
What got to me in this is there's footage of the day that the trial ends. The first trial ended with an acquittal, and then by the end there were only prosecuting 2 people. One was fully acquitted. One was acquitted, and then there were some charges where there was a hung jury. And that was tried again. That was also a hung jury. That was also thrown out. Again, later analysis kind of looked at it and said, we don't think anything ever happened there. But the children, there were 12 children who testified against these people from the stand. Here they are 5 years or more after the events that they are testifying about. They're like mid-teens. And of course they believe it happened, right? Like they fully believe it happened. And if you understand kind of how they got to that place, you understand why they believe it happened. So they're sitting there thinking, these people who put me through satanic ritual abuse, who, and I won't lay out the details of what they did to them and all this, they're getting off. And we have the tape of, some clips from that thing. And it's just gut-wrenching to hear these kids. Yeah. They're scared. They're confused. They don't, and to me, that's the weight of it. And that's the thing that affected me the most, like working on this episode, was just hearing these kids and just thinking, how do you comfort these kids?
Yeah.
And where are they now? There's been some reporting on that. We have a little in the show, but to come. But that and McMartin was one of 100 instances of daycares that were subsequently invested in one form or another for satanic ritual abuse. None of which, at this point, the FBI thinks anything actually happened at.
Wow. Oh my goodness. I mean, and people listen to I mean, I guess true. And people listen to this for entertainment. I mean, I guess true crime is an actual genre, right? I mean,
Right.
so, and we have the Be
and the
Afraid
thing
podcast to talk about, the
Right.
sort of psychology around that. Yeah.
Well, and where we're going, and this is where next week's episode really picks up on this, is what else is going on? Like the danger of these kinds of stories, particularly when they're like fully fabricated, is well, if our attention's over here, what else is going on? And that's a reckoning that the church, in some ways is still dealing with in the last few years about what was happening in the church in the 1980s while we were worried about the Satanists next door.
Yeah, yeah. Have you heard from people so far? I mean, surely you've heard from some folks who have responded. Has there been anything surprising or something that you didn't expect in responses that you've received to the show so far?
I can't say I've seen anything too surprising just yet. We've spent a lot of time, mostly we've heard from people who are kind of saying, man, this was my world. I grew up immersed in this. I grew up hearing these stories. I grew up with, and I think this is one of the key things. People saying, I grew up with parents that were terrified that this was going to happen to me. They heard these stories in the news. They heard these stories at church. They were terrified that I was going to go to daycare or preschool or whatever else, and someone was going to get to me in this way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it feels a lot like the Mars Hill show in that way of just the stories being deeply resonant with listeners. Yeah. Wow. Do you think that, this Pew study came out just like, well, it's been 9 days, maybe 10 days ago now, that says that Americans, while we're not particularly religious, we are quite spiritual. We're interested in spirituality. Do you think, I mean, when you were planning this podcast over a year ago, you don't know that this Pew study is coming out to say these things, but does it feel like maybe a particularly resonant time to be talking about the kind of principalities and powers stuff that for Christians is very real, but for a lot of this sort of postmodern world or a highly secularized world, very material world, they tend to kind of laugh at, even talk about the devil.
No, I think it's a great moment for a story like this, and I think part of the reason why it's a great moment is that whatever we mean by a secular age, we talked about this on the Bulletin last week a little bit. It's worth repeating though. Like when Charles Taylor talks about the idea of us living in a secular age, he doesn't mean living in an age without spirituality, living in an age without God. He means actually living in an age where all of that is questioned, right? All of that is subject to these counter pressures and these different ideas, and religion of any sort is an option. I feel like we're living in a moment now, in particular, where the options are getting wider, right? I mean, I hear young people in particular talking more and more about things like the horoscope, right? And kind of taking it seriously, like, well, this is my sign, so I do this and I do that. And it's like a throwback to the sort of the way the way people in Woody Allen movies from the early 70s talked about their horoscopes. So I don't know. I mean, I think there's something happening where there's kind of a spiritual openness right now. I think there's a lot of reasons for it, and we could talk about those probably for a long time. But I do think there's a spiritual openness right now, which is on one side positive, because I think a spiritual openness means an opportunity to present the gospel story in a way that's really beautiful and compelling. But it's also openness to problematic ideas and dangerous ideas. And even for Christians in an atmosphere of spiritual openness, possibly an openness to hucksterism and being taken advantage of.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Well, I want to pause and just say hello to some of the folks who've joined us. Hi to our viewer from Melbourne, Australia. I wonder what time it is in Australia. Calgary, Saskatoon, so many of you from out of the country. Welcome. Hello from Virginia. Thanks for joining us. And Oregon. So glad to have you with us. If you have a question for Mike or me, go ahead and stick it in the chat. We're going to answer as many questions as we can tonight. Thank you again for joining us. We love to just hang out here every second Tuesday of the month on YouTube and talk about some lighter things. Although perhaps we dove into the deep
heavy,
end
didn't we?
right
Yeah,
away.
we got
Let's
heavy.
lighten it up. Let's talk about Timothy Chalamet, shall we? Yes,
If it makes
yes,
you happy,
and amen.
which
We shall.
clearly it does.
I know.
I was. Oh, here he
Oh,
is.
we have a video.
Oh yeah.
The classiest thing would be to downplay the effort that went into this role and how much this means to me, but the truth is this was 5.5 years of my life. I poured everything I had into playing this incomparable artist, Mr. Bob Dylan, a true American hero, and it was the honor of a lifetime playing him. It's an honor I share with Monica, Elle, Edward, the entire cast, who, in a genre, doing a biopic that could be perhaps tired. Everyone gave it their all. So I'm deeply grateful to them. And lastly, I can't downplay the significance of this award because it means the most to me. And I know we're in a subjective business, but the truth is, I'm really in pursuit of greatness. I know people don't usually talk like that, but I want to be one of the greats. I'm inspired by the greats. I'm inspired by the greats here tonight. I'm as inspired by Daniel Day-Lewis, Marlon Brando, and Viola Davis as I am by Michael Jordan and Michael Phelps, and I want to be up there. So I'm deeply grateful to that. This doesn't signify that, but it's a little more fuel. It's a little more ammo to keep going. Thank you so much.
My goodness. I wanted to know how he didn't know how to fix the microphone. That's just an aside. I feel like, I mean, I have to have my 17-year-old son help me out with my audio, but I know how to raise the microphone. But you know what? We're gonna give him a bye because it was a big moment. That's from the Screen Actors Guild Awards. You know, I was really hoping that he would win Best Actor at the Oscars. You know, 8-time nominee for A Complete Unknown, his biopic about Bob Dylan. He didn't win it, but that speech really stood out. You know, Vogue, somebody from Vogue responded that, you know, he was trying too hard to put himself in the limelight. There have been other critiques of him, just unabashed ambition. And but I thought it was really interesting. Susie Weiss over at the Free Press wrote this piece called Timothy Chalamet and the Rise of the Tryhards, rather. And she contrasted it with this idea of Brat from Charlie XCX from last summer, this kind of like rude, ironic distance, flippant kind of party girl look. And Susie says in her piece, ironic distance, the default until lately for celebrities and cool kids, feels played out. Tryhards aren't afraid to come off like they care too much or look silly doing so. And, you know, that really struck me, not only because I really love his performances in like Little Women, Beautiful Boy. I just finished A Complete Unknown because I like to watch things streaming, so I don't go to the movie theater all that often. But
That's a real shame.
really?
Yeah, movies are meant to be on the big screen. Like if it's a good movie, go see it on the screen. There's nothing like it. There's nothing like that experience. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's
Finish your
okay.
thought.
I find that the
I saw that
Dolby
one- so
Atmos
I
is
saw that one
really
twice.
overwhelming.
Oh, theaters are too loud. Now that's another old man shaking his cane. You know,
Okay,
like that
shake your cane.
congressman yelling
Yeah.
at Trump. Yeah, theaters are too loud. They're way too loud. They could turn down easily 10 to 15 decibels and we would all be fine. But
Okay.
the visual is what you're there for. And that was that was actually a great film to see on the big screen.
It was stunning.
It was shot
mean,
beautifully.
on the little screen.
Yeah.
I read a piece about the blue jeans and the transition of it was in the New York Times about the costume designer and how she shaped the jeans throughout the show to talk about, you know, to sort of embody different parts of him. But I did want to go back to this idea because his speech was a little bit of a lightning rod. And you know, it does feel like kind of a transition. Like slacker cool used to be cool. Do you think he's trying too hard? Or, you know, when he says, like, I want to be one of the greats, are we not okay saying that? Is a man not okay saying that?
Well, why would a man not be okay saying that? Like, who's okay saying that and who's not? I'm curious why you bring up a man for that. Why do you gender that, Clarissa?
Well, I feel like in a lot of spaces, the pursuit of ambition is perceived to be equal to toxic masculinity. Like a man who is very motivated, who, you know, maybe has blinders on his eyes for career ambitions or whatever it is, that he's considered to be inhumane in some way.
Right.
And I just wonder if maybe
totally,
that's
I
a
follow.
particular critique for men. I don't know.
You know what? Actually, as we talk about it, like what comes to mind for me is David Foster Wallace had this great, it was a theme in a number of his essays. So Wallace was a writer who really kind of came into his own in the 1990s, kind of early mid 90s in particular, and the way Wallace saw the world at the time, in particular, the kind of the king of comedy and the king of pop culture in that window was Dave Letterman. If you knew what was cool, you loved Dave.
Yeah.
And David Foster Wallace, again, maybe the greatest literary novelist of the 1990s, probably the greatest, certainly the greatest essayist, literary essayist of the 1990s and early 2000s was Wallace. I would argue for that anyway. Wallace had a complicated point of view on Letterman because he liked Letterman. He thought Letterman was funny, but he also thought Letterman had ushered in this era of cynicism. Because Letterman was like perpetually this like all shucks Midwestern guy that was just totally detached from anything. He wasn't excited about anything. He didn't show like he wasn't a fan of anybody. There were no rules. There were no shibboleths or whatever. Now, a lot of us know like kind of the later Letterman, where later Letterman he had a lot of control over his show, and so he really only had people on that he had affection for. And he showed a lot more affection kind of later in the show. Like we all know Dave loved Norm Macdonald. Dave loved the Foo Fighters. Like he, and then what he's done with his interview shows and stuff since then has been much more kind of in the realm of sincerity. But all that to say, for Wallace was always contrasting this idea of like cynicism and sincerity. Culture, the easy mode for us, both in relationships and in pop culture and whatnot, is the cynical role. We're going to be detached. We're not going to be a fan of anything, and there's no vulnerability to it. And Wallace wanted sincerity. Wallace wanted us to rip our hearts open a bit and say something real, say something true. So that's the element of. And I've got mixed feelings on Chalamet as an actor, but I think he was fantastic in Complete Unknown. But I like this. I like him getting up there and saying, I want to do something that matters. I want to do something that lasts. I want to make something that people remember. I mean, I think that's a performance that people will remember, but I also don't think that's his last one. I think he's got a lot of capabilities for sure.
Yeah. Well,
So.
Susie Weiss mentioned Ariana Grande as well, really wanting that role in Wicked, and a similar kind of response, like being able to articulate clearly her ambitions, and I don't remember her receiving a ton of critique for that. Maybe it's okay in female circles to say things like that. Maybe it's still like vestiges of girl power. But one thing that Susie mentions in her piece is she mentions Elon Musk, and she also mentions Alex Karp, the CEO of Palantir, as two other tryhards. We see both of them trying very hard. How would you nuance that a little bit? Would you put all four of those people in the same category as people who are aspiring to greatness?
Oh goodness. Okay, so I've got Elon.
Yep.
I got Palantir. I
Yep.
got Chalamet.
And Ariana Grande.
Ariana Grande. Okay. Look, I think there's like Elon just kind of sends my brain to weird places in this conversation, because Elon has, one of Elon's biographers in particular in the last number of weeks has talked about how he feels like the Elon he wrote a book about is not the Elon that we're seeing right now. There's something else going on with this guy, who's kind of like, his personal life has gotten really, really strange. His professional life has gotten really strange. He's really fallen in love with ketamine treatments. Over the weekend, he called Mark Kelly a traitor for saying we should continue our support to Ukraine. Mark Kelly, the U.S. Senator, NASA astronaut, and war hero. So Elon kind of throws me off for that. So I'm going to throw him out of the mix. But I mean, I do think the idea that we should set big goals and try for them I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think the question, I think the urgent thing for Christians to always think about in this conversation is there a point in any of this where people become means to other ends, where we're willing to let, people get mowed over underneath the bus in pursuit of other ends? That's where it becomes really a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. If your ambition is not marked by the fruits of the Spirit, you're probably headed in the wrong direction. Yeah.
Right.
And, I am a 2025 fellow with the Center for Christianity and Public Life.
And you
We
went on a
attended.
retreat last week
Yeah,
for this.
yeah, we went on our retreat last week, and this was actually a conversation that we had about power and ambition and how do Christians rightly see it. We've got this interview coming up with you and Miroslav Wolf about the cost of ambition. It feels like, in as much as we've had to really call out narcissism in the church, like ambition gone awry, it does seem like there is space to talk about ambition done rightly, because we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like it's good for Christians to rightly desire power, used in love, and power that is defined by the fruits of the Spirit. But actually, how to do that, I think, takes some discipleship and conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I heard Miroslav speak on this a couple of weeks ago, and it was a really interesting talk. And what he did in the talk was he essentially he set up this contrast that I think is unique to his thinking. That was a contrast between ambition, which was this idea, as he framed it, kind of a competitiveness. It's not just I win, it's I win, you lose. And then the contrast was with excellence. I want something to be as well made and as beautifully made as it can be on its own terms, right? And excellence is always contextual. It's always and it's always relative to the person pursuing it and the context in which it's pursued. And I think there's something helpful about the paradigm. I mean, I say that as somebody who, I believe in meritocracy, and he was kind of poo-pooing meritocracy in the talk. I'm eager to read the book. It just showed up in the mail before he and I sit down. But I do think there's something to that. I do think there's something to, because I also think there's something to this idea that my success doesn't have to come on the backs of other people's failures, right? Like there's an abundance to the world that makes that possible for me, whether I'm in the stock market or whether I'm an artist trying to make it in my local art scene. There should be the world should have a big enough tent for all of us. I mean, I think that's the nature of creation.
Yeah. Well, Timothy Chalamet, we're cheering you on. I'm cheering you on.
I am too. I'm not cheering against him. That's for sure.
Well, I want to pause here and ask a couple of questions that we've gotten from our listeners. Jeff is listening in from Bozeman, and he's curious how much time we are able to spend in show prep. I mean, I read the news for 3 hours every day. I read it for 90 minutes in the morning, right when I begin my workday, and then I read it again at 3 o'clock, from 3 to 4:30. And that's just reading the news. So that's 15 hours of news in a work week. And then there's prep on top of that. But what about you? How do you prep to show up on an interview, on a deep dive conversation day, or on a roundtable day?
Yeah, so I all that's different for me. My main kind of rhythms are similar to yours. There's a big chunk of my morning that I try to devote to reading the news every single day, hour to an hour and a half. I get more closer to an hour on a normal basis, and then I would say afternoons, evenings, I'm squeezing in, I don't know, probably collectively another 45 minutes or so of reading different stuff as it comes in, or I see it posted to Twitter or that sort of thing. But my schedule is much less structured on that front. For me, prepping for the show, oftentimes whatever is coming up on the schedule, when we decide on topics, whether it's Tuesday or Wednesday that we decide on the topics, we record Thursday morning. If it's stuff that I know well, I'm usually just the morning of, I'll take an hour, 45 minutes, and just jot down a thought or two that I know I want to make sure that I get in there. if we're talking about something that I'm less familiar with, then I'll intentionally set aside an hour to 2 hours the day before
Okay.
to just read up and kind of absorb as much as I can.
So Justin Johansson wanted to know if there are podcasts that we listen to or inspired by. Do you include podcasts as part of your research?
For sure. Yeah, I mean, if I am not sitting down reading something, if I'm like up doing anything, I usually am listening to a podcast. I listen
Really?
to a ton of podcasts. For me, the ones that I listen to religiously, I try to get a spectrum of
Hmm.
ideas, right? So some of the ones that I listen to religiously, I think for sure the Commentary Magazine daily podcast. I don't know that that's a daily hour to hour and a half show that I don't think I've missed an episode of since 2021.
Wow, you should
And
get a sweatshirt or something.
I have one. I
Oh,
bought the sweatshirt. It says "Crushing Morosity,"
oh my
Commentary
goodness.
Magazine daily podcast. Shout out to John Podhoretz,
There you go.
my favorite person in the world. But but along with that, so I listen to Pod Save America on a pretty regular basis.
Mhm.
Those guys are very, very, very left wing. I listen to the editors at National Review. It's a
Mhm.
great show. I listen to the Dispatch podcast on a regular basis. I mean, I could keep going for a long time here. I listen to the Ezra
Wow.
Klein show quite a bit. I listen to every episode of Jonah Goldberg's podcast, The Remnant. It's always interesting. And then there's certain things like topically, there's a bunch of stuff that I'll kind of work in depending on
Mhm.
what else is going on. The Times of Israel Daily podcast is a really great show about the war, and kind of what's unfolding there. There's a podcast from The Telegraph, which is a British publication called Ukraine the Latest, that is a daily 30 to 45 minute update on what happened in the war yesterday. And
Wow.
it's in depth, it's terrific. Their footnotes are great, send you to a lot of articles. If you really want to understand what's going on in the Ukraine war, for sure listen to that. I'll stop, but I
Do
could
you
probably
practice
go
silence? Do
10
you, I
more.
mean,
I
do you
mean, I
have any
sleep
moments of silence in your day?
when I go to sleep, for sure.
Oh, okay.
You
All
know,
right.
yeah.
You don't fall asleep listening to a podcast?
Not fall asleep watching television.
Oh my gosh. No way. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Well,
Don't worry, I'm in therapy.
I don't listen to podcasts. I have made it. I feel like part of that is because of what my work is. You know, I am when I'm listening to our show, when I am producing it, I'm listening for all kinds of very particular things. And
Right.
so I find that I'm not a super good podcast listener in general.
Hmm.
Um, I I'm used to listening to podcasts because I have to respond to them in some way. And so I prefer reading, actually. I do listen to Russell's podcast, Russell Moore Show. I highly recommend it. I listen to it every time I go on a flight. It is like my calming space. I listen to Russell's voice. And so I always download my podcast. Usually, when I'm at the gate, I choose what I
Hmm.
want to listen to while I'm at the gate, kind of depending on my emotional mood at the time. And and then I listen to Russell's podcast while I fly. I don't actually, related to that, I don't read the news at all on a day that I fly. I made a commitment to doing
Hmm.
that because flying is just makes me anxious. It always has. And for a long time, I didn't like flying at all. Like wouldn't get on a plane. And so coming back to flying regularly, which is what I do now, I'm flying monthly for work. I find that I need to create space for my brain to breathe, for my
Hmm.
spirit to breathe, and so yeah, I make a habit that I don't read any news on the day that I fly, and I listen to Russell. So
So,
yeah.
so I'm a pretty easy flyer. I'm not
Hmm.
that stressed out by it. I kind of like airports. I actually like, I
Oh
think,
wow.
but my dad designed runways and we
Oh
were around
really?
airports a lot as kids. And so
Huh.
I was always kind of, so I think there's something weirdly sort of comforting about that.
Yeah.
But uh, when you taxi to the runway and the plane
Hmm.
turns right before it gets off, I do always make peace with God right at that moment.
You
Like
should.
there is just a little flash, like we're good,
Yes.
right? Everything
Yeah.
good, you know? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you are not alone, right?
Oh, I think
Because,
everybody does. Yeah. Or
because
a lot of people do.
well, certainly with all of the FAA issues that we have had over the last month or so, um, I think there are a lot of people who are very anxious about flying. And that was before people were anxious about flying. And that is, sorry, is since people have been anxious about flying,
Right.
before all of these accidents, people were already uncomfortable. I think it's why people get angry on planes, because it kind
Yeah.
of like all that anxiety bubbles up. But anyways, yeah, so I'm not a podcast listener. I do love
That's really
Russell's
funny.
show though. Yeah. So, okay. So let's talk about our next topic because you know what? I am really fascinated by what's happening here. For a lot of Republicans, they were undecided voters. The last the last election was really challenging for people, and I want to say that because I think that too often we make things we try. Oh, just a second here. Oh
Lose your
my,
notes?
yeah. Well, I can't see you anymore. You can see me though, right?
I see you. You're still
Oh
here.
my. Okay. Well,
You're still here, and we're still live.
there we go. Oh my goodness. Okay. So, the 2020 elections, we saw people who voted for Donald Trump who were not comfortable voting for him this time. And we also saw people vote in 2020 for the Democratic candidate who were not comfortable voting for the Democratic candidate this time around. And part of that, one of the sort of lightning rod topics has been trans issues, right?
Right.
And this week, Gavin Newsom, the California governor, he described trans athletes playing in women's sports as deeply unfair. And, talk about Timothy Chalamet's speech being a lightning rod. This is that's a big statement to make. And there were very few Democrats who stood behind him. And so I wanted to talk about that because I think it matters a lot the way that we have seen both the left and the right respond. Um,
Yeah.
Before the election, but certainly now in this first, 51 days of the new Trump administration. So,
Yeah.
can you just give me a little bit of, you have been following this story for a while now. Can
Right.
you give me some background to just help me understand what's the landscape in which this comment happened?
Yeah. So I think if you want to understand the catalyst to why this story has taken such a big role in American politics, it really comes back to the story of Leah Thomas. Leah Thomas was a transgender woman, so a male that transitioned to female, swimmer at oh goodness, I think it's University of Pennsylvania, right? And they were sort of a mid-level swimmer on the men's team, and when they got to the women's team, all of a sudden they were at the top of the national charts, and so Thomas came into the NCAA, and the NCAA decided to let them compete, and they were quite dominant. Broke a number of records, won a number of medals at national awards, and that sort of thing. And what came out of that was just an enormous number of photos of Thomas on the medal stand next to his female competitors. And the contrast is just stark because Thomas is 6'4", and most of his competitors were, anywhere from 6 to 10 to 12 inches shorter than him. And I am using the male pronoun for Thomas intentionally. I mean, it's an editorial thing that we do at CT. So I think that I think what came out of that was just a sudden awareness of like, well, wait, where else is this happening? And what people quickly discovered is that it was happening a lot of places. And in fact, it was almost as though Thomas succeeding was kind of like a permission structure for a lot of transgender athletes to begin competing, or a lot of athletes who were, let's give them the benefit of the doubt, were wanting to transition, decided to transition, and began competing against women. You've seen, transgender athletes dominate sports like track and field, cycling, combat sports, all kinds of different places. When Trump came into office this year, so Trump made this a stump speech issue.
Yeah, it was
for
that
sure.
they them commercial. Remember
Yeah,
that Kamala Harris is for they
commercial,
them?
right? Yeah, that there was that because he ran against in that ad he used a statement by Harris saying that we should use taxpayer funding to cover transgender transition surgeries for illegal immigrants in U.S. prisons, which is, quite the claim. And but you had personalities like Megyn Kelly who had been pretty hostile to Trump at various times, like basically joined him on the stump speech because of this issue alone. And there were a lot of people who I think were motivated by this issue. Trump has signed an executive order banning transgender athletes in women's sports. The Department of Education has begun investigations into schools that are allowing transgender athletes in women's sports. It threatens the loss of federal funding, not just for the athletics departments, but for the schools as a whole. San Jose State is being targeted right now. And then like there are some states that are saying, look, we're going to defy this. We're not going to put up with it. We'll see you in court, like the state of Maine. So it's in the context of all of this that Gavin Newsom makes his comment. Interestingly, he made it in a conversation with Charlie Kirk from Turning Point USA, who's like a very, very, very pro-Trump, right-wing kind of figure. The first guest Newsom had on his new podcast. I mean, so all that to say, I think what you're seeing with Newsom in particular is, like this is the opening salvo of campaign, 20, what would it be, 2028, and also I think you're seeing, I think you're seeing people try to figure out how do we it's obviously a 70% plus issue in national polling. So you're going to see people kind of moving in that direction. I think the question for Christians in the midst of this, and this is the challenge of it, is I am, the logic behind Trump's executive orders, I'm fully in support of. I think there's a danger in pursuing this in a way that is actually still nonetheless sort of like dehumanizing of those that are experiencing gender dysphoria. When I think about a young person who's wanting to transition from male to female, are there people out there who want to do that transition just to make sure that they win the medal? I mean, absolutely. People do all kinds of crazy things to win. There was that incredible documentary about doping in sports from a few years ago. I think it's not Prometheus. It's what was the Greek character that like flies towards the sun and
I don't know.
The glue melts, right?
Oh, see, I didn't read Rick
I'm
Riordan.
gonna have to look at it. I can't remember it, but that's the documentary. It's named after them, and you see in it that people are like, look, if I take all of these performance enhancing drugs, and it means that I die at 30, but I win a gold medal, it's totally worth it. Like, so are there people that would transition with that kind of logic and motivation? I think that's probably true. I think that's probably happened. I won't speculate who's doing it or who's not because I haven't talked to any of these people. But I also think there's a lot of probably transgender youth that are either genuinely struggling with dysmorphia issues, gender dysmorphia issues, or they're struggling with the social contagion. But there's a sense in which it doesn't matter why they're struggling. Ultimately, these are young people who are very confused about what did God make me to be and what's my place in the world. And I think for Christians, we ought to find a way to say, hey, we think there are boundaries that are worth defending in terms of not allowing male-born athletes to compete against young women. But isn't there a way to like fight for those boundaries that expresses compassion for people who are really struggling? And that's not something that I see as a part of this conversation at all.
No, this conversation feels absolutely devoid of compassion. Yeah. I would say on both sides. That it is devoid of nuance. It is devoid of compassion. Each side believes that they are acting with compassion, but I'm not entirely convinced that either response is particularly compassionate. One of the things that really struck me was that there's like no way to be moderate. I think about the Republican Party and how really the Republican Party pushed out a lot of people who wanted to moderate the kinds of messaging that were a part of the last campaign. And it's like this is the same thing. Like there can be no spectrum of opinion within either party. That you are all in, you drink all the Kool-Aid, or you're not a part of the party at all.
Yeah.
And that seems to just be problematic, particularly on a subject like this that requires so much gentleness and so much nuance and such a good capacity for listening. If you can't do that even within your party, how can you ever imagine that you're going to be good at it talking to someone with whom you have great difference?
Right. Well, and I think that's one of the great risks of our political moment is that it lives and thrives on dehumanizing people, right? We want to dehumanize our enemies. We want to make them into like utter villains. And so if you can turn these trans athletes into just pure villains, then it can justify all kinds of stuff, right? That can go a lot of different places that get, frankly, they get really dark and leave me really, really concerned. I feel like there's a burden upon Christians in a moment like this to find the path towards speaking the truth in love. Like we can, and when Paul says that in the book of Ephesians, we often think of that as just sort of primarily like an interrelational kind of thing. Paul's actually talking about dogma. He's talking about like doctrine, like what are the truthful things? How do we declare those things? And so there's something to the idea of saying we want to plant a flag around the idea that human beings are made in the image of God, and male and female they were created, and that's fundamentally a good thing. But we want to do that in a way that doesn't invite cruelty upon those whose own loves are disordered about that.
Yeah. Well, there is, this concept.
Oh, the podcast, the documentary is called the documentary is Icarus. I don't think that's right.
Icarus, that's who it was.
I don't think that's it. That's probably it.
Okay.
I keep saying dysmorphia, and I think it is dysphoria. Yeah, dysphoria. I keep saying dysmorphia. It's gender
Okay.
dysphoria.
Well,
Two fixes right there at once.
Oh, well, it's okay. We're live. We are learning as we go. Yeah, I think there's this concept of proximate justice, right? That we can't always get all of what we want, but that we are always striving toward ultimate justice. And I feel like Christians in particular should be able to model that understanding of living between the times, that that this sort of hyper polarization of you're all in or you're all out, that doesn't involve nuance, that doesn't acknowledge the very great complexities that exist here. I feel like we should be better at that than we are. Do you think that part of why we struggle against this is because we have sort of a we're marching to Zion kind of victory in Jesus perspective about how we believe we can clean up the world?
Nope, I don't think that at all.
What is it?
I think that we are creatures who exist based upon like our posture towards the world is something that has been formed through practice, right? And the practices of our politics are about combat. They're not about gentleness. They're not about love. They're not about kindness to neighbor or anything. What is the emerging the emerging animus of the right and the left right now is all about power. What we have seen with Trump is Trump took office, and he is working hard right now to see how far can I push executive power, whether it's cutting off funding to things that are congressionally funded, right? That's going to lead to a court battle. He's likely going to lose a lot of those, but he's going to push it. He's going to see how far he can push it to get there. And the point is not just about executive power, but it's about coalitional power. How far can our coalition get with the things that we want to get done, that that we think are good for, whatever ends in the world. So so we're creatures of habit and creatures of practice, and if the only way that we've ever seen and heard politics practice is the politics of power, the politics of not just I win, but I win, you lose. And look, and I think people who are more sympathetic to Trump would probably say, well, isn't that exactly what we saw from the left? And I think that's true. I think you've seen a lot of that from the left. There is the fact that the Biden administration was arresting people for praying outside of abortion clinics, the fact that the Obama Justice Department was prosecuting nuns that didn't want to pay for birth control. Like, that's power politics stuff, and it's not about like individual liberty or anything like that. It's power. It's let's punish those who get in our way. So I think that's the problem. It's a spiritual formation problem, and we need better witness from Christian leaders who are able to say, we're not going to take part in the, we don't want to punish our enemies. We just want the liberty to do the things that give us meaning and help us form deep and rich communities with our own families and friends and churches.
Yeah. Well, this has been here in Massachusetts, where I live. Representative Seth Moulton is another one who has joined his voice with Mr. Newsom. And so it feels like this is going to be a conversation we watch happen and emerge over the months to come as these people, as you say, start to think about what the elections might look for them coming in the future.
Well, and I don't think that it's a foregone conclusion that everyone's going to follow the path of Newsom.
No.
Because you've seen John Fetterman this week come out and say, I'm not really there. Like, I think there's better ways to solve these problems at a local level, and we don't need to be involved in this kind of thing. And there's a lot of ways that I think the left is trying to sort of figure out who are we and what do we do now. I mean, we could say a lot about the what's happening with these deportations and other stuff, but for that, I guess people should come back on Friday for the Friday Bulletin episode.
Yeah, we'll talk about it. Well, as we wrap up tonight, I want to do our mountain or molehill because I got a couple for you. Okay, so major market sell-off on Monday. Dow Jones drops. Even Tesla lost $16 billion this week in their stock drop. Fears of recession, mountain or molehill?
I mean, oh goodness. So I think the fact that people like Larry Summers are kind of sounding the alarm makes me go probably more serious.
Okay.
But how much is the alarm real alarm, and how much is it trying to signal to the president, dude, this is not good. Don't do this. I don't know. The old cliche that like you judge the stock market on the long haul, not the day, is something that I don't think that's a rule that you break. But I also think that when the vast number of economists are looking at Trump's policies on tariffs and saying this is going to be bad, we should probably anticipate, like, when the market starts to turn bad, that's probably something to take seriously.
All right. Well, if you like this little bit of a conversation, join us on Friday because we're going to talk more about this with Charlie Sykes. But here's our next one. Amazon Prime Video started streaming The Apprentice this week. Mountain or molehill?
The television show or the movie?
The television show. I never watched any of it, which you're not surprised.
I think that's a molehill.
That's a molehill? Okay.
Yeah,
it doesn't mean anything special with Jeff Bezos and the administration?
I don't think so. I mean,
okay.
Look, streamers want clicks. Like, if that's going to get them clicks, they're going to sell it. Like, you know what I mean? Like, if hot dog vendors could make more money selling churros, they'd be selling churros. So.
Good point. And I would buy them. Okay, next one. Because of lagging earnings, Southwest Airlines announced this week that it will alter its free baggage policy, now charging some customers for checked bags. Mountain or molehill?
I hate Southwest anyway, so yeah.
Oh, come on.
Like,
they're my airline of choice. Because
hate-
I'm allowed to choose.
Yeah, I mean, you're allowed to choose on any airline.
Oh yeah,
Like
but for a
it's
price.
yeah, man, no, I hate
All right.
Southwest. Drives
All
me
right.
nuts.
Wow. Okay.
Because you
Film.
gotta click as quick as you can to make sure that you're not stuck
I'm going to
between
be in
two
the A
people.
section.
Ugh,
Yes.
oh gosh, drives me nuts. I hate it. I'm
Okay,
down
here's
on
your next one
Southwest.
that I
All
feel
right.
this one might be very near and dear to you. I don't
Oh
know.
dear.
Film critic Allison McCullough offers vegan alerts in her movie reviews on the app Letterboxd as she assesses movies for their quote on-screen portrayals of dairy, poultry, and beef unquote to highlight issues of animal welfare. Mountain or molehill, Michael?
Oh, what a stupid time to be alive. You know what it reminds me of? There in the early days of the internet, someone bought the rights to all the available URLs for PETA, people for the ethical
Yeah,
treatment of animals.
yeah.
PETA.com, PETA.org, PETA.net, like they bought all of them. And they were basically what a lot of people do is they buy these things and they sit on them and they kind of extort whoever wants them
Yeah,
for
yeah.
whatever price. So they were trying to extort PETA out of like an enormous amount of money for the URL. And PETA got mad and walked away and said, we don't care. We don't want it or whatever. So they put up a website at all those URLs that was people eating tasty animals. And it
Oh
was
my.
just photos of cuts of meat and how to prepare them. And apparently PETA paid an enormous amount of money to get the URL away from them. That's what I think about when I hear that, because I just think it's the most ridiculous thing ever. But
So I will never convince you to be a vegan film critic.
oh, good heavens, no.
Never, never. Well, it's 10:01. We've run over 1 minute. Thank you for hanging in there with us, listeners. We hope that it's been an entertaining and informative evening for us. Keep the conversation with us going over at our Substack, thebulletinpodcast.substack.com. Check out today's deep dive conversation. I talk with Rick Steves about pilgrimage and travel and how it makes us better global citizens. And join us on Friday. We're going to be talking to Pete Wayner. We're going to be talking to Miriam Waba. We're going to be talking to Charlie Sykes. It's going to be a good time. Thanks so much for being with us tonight. See y'all later.